The entire conference room erupted in laughter when I declined their job offer. Peterson, the HR director, leaned back in his leather chair with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Good luck finding something better in this market," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. I stood up, gathered my portfolio with steady hands despite the rage burning in my chest, and delivered my response with ice-cold precision. The laughter died instantly. As I walked out of Iron Veil Industries that day, I had no idea that 3 days later, their CEO would call me personally and say the words that would change everything. "Name your price." My name is Natalie Graves, and I've spent the last 15 years perfecting the science of rare metal alloy recycling. It's not the sexiest field in materials engineering, but when you can extract platinum group metals from industrial waste at 97% efficiency, people tend to notice. Or at least, they should. That Tuesday morning at Iron Veil Industries started like any other final interview. I'd already passed their technical assessments with flying colors, impressed their department heads with my proprietary extraction methods, and even received enthusiastic nods during my presentation on sustainable manufacturing. The company was legendary in the recycling industry, a $2.8 billion operation that prided itself on innovation and environmental leadership. I should have seen the red flags when Vance Peterson walked into that conference room. Everything about him screamed middle management mediocrity, from his too-tight suit to the way he barely glanced at my portfolio before sliding a single sheet of paper across the mahogany table. "We're pleased to offer you a position as Materials Development Specialist," he announced, as if bestowing some great honor. I scanned the offer. The salary figure made my stomach drop. It was $35,000 less than my previous role and barely above what they'd pay a fresh graduate. For someone with 3 patents and a proven track record of saving companies millions in raw material costs, it was insulting. "I believe there's been a mistake," I said calmly, pushing the paper back. "This compensation doesn't reflect the senior-level position we've been discussing." Peterson's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "That's our standard offer for this role. Very competitive for the current market." "Competitive?" I kept my voice level despite the anger building. "I've researched industry standards. This is 40% below market rate for someone with my expertise." "Well," he chuckled, exchanging glances with his 2 HR associates. "Perhaps you've overestimated your market value. This is a prestigious opportunity to work with Iron Veil." I stood up, feeling the weight of every professional slight I'd ever endured. Every stolen idea, every dismissive comment, every time my expertise was questioned while less qualified colleagues advanced past me. Not this time. "Prestige doesn't pay my mortgage, Mr. Peterson, and working for a company that undervalues talent from the first interaction tells me everything I need to know about Iron Veil's actual commitment to innovation." That's when the laughter started. Peterson's associates couldn't contain their amusement. Even the receptionist visible through the glass partition seemed to be smirking. Peterson himself leaned back, that insufferable grin spreading across his face. "Good luck finding something better in this market," he said. I locked eyes with him, letting the silence stretch until the laughter faded to uncomfortable shifting. "I don't need luck, Mr. Peterson. I have something far more valuable, talent that your company apparently can't afford. When Iron Veil's recycling efficiency drops next quarter because you're hiring bargain bin specialists instead of proven experts, remember this moment." The room went silent. Peterson's face flushed red, his mouth opening and closing like a gasping fish. I gathered my materials with deliberate precision, savoring their stunned expressions. As I reached the door, I turned back one final time. "Oh, and Mr. Peterson, you might want to Google my name. The last company that tried to lowball me lost a $50 million contract to their competitor 6 months later. Guess who developed the winning technology?" The elevator ride down felt like the longest of my life. My hands shook as I gripped my portfolio, doubt creeping in with each floor. Had I just destroyed my career over pride? In my car, I sat staring at the Iron Veil building, its gleaming facade now seeming like a monument to my possible stupidity. But as I drove away, I made a promise to myself. Never again would I accept being valued at less than my worth. Never again would I smile politely while someone tried to diminish my achievements. I had no idea that my defiance had already set wheels in motion. That right now, in a laboratory 2 floors up, the technical team was pulling my portfolio from the conference room trash where Peterson had tossed it. That they were about to discover what Peterson's ego had dismissed. A recycling methodology that could revolutionize their entire operation. 3 days. That's all it would take before my phone would ring with a call that would validate every risk I'd ever taken. But in that moment, driving away from Iron Vale with my dignity intact and my future uncertain, all I knew was that I'd finally stood up for myself. And it felt damn good. The betrayal that changed everything happened 18 months earlier at the International Materials Innovation Summit in Chicago. I'd spent 6 months developing a revolutionary process for extracting rare earth elements from electronic waste, a breakthrough that could have transformed the industry. My boss at the time, Jenna Holloway, had been supportive, even enthusiastic, promising to showcase my work to the board. I still remember the moment my world tilted off its axis. Sitting in that packed auditorium, watching Jenna stride confidently onto the stage, I felt proud, right up until she began presenting my research as her own. Every graph, every molecular diagram, every painstakingly calculated efficiency metric, all displayed on that massive screen with her name prominently featured as lead researcher. My name appeared once, buried in a list of contributing team members in font so small it was barely visible from the third row where I sat. The applause was deafening. Industry leaders approached her afterward, eager to discuss implementation. $1 million partnerships were forged over cocktails while I stood frozen by the exit, holding a glass of champagne that tasted like ashes. Great team effort, Jenna had said when she finally found me, her smile sharp as glass. Your supporting data really helped flesh out my concept. Supporting data. My concept reduced to supporting data. I quit 2 weeks later. But not before I heard through the grapevine that Jenna's breakthrough had earned her a VP position and a $400,000 bonus. My resignation letter was professional, brief. I didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't even request recognition. I simply believed that good work would speak for itself, that merit would eventually win. What a fool I'd been. That night in Chicago taught me a brutal lesson about professional naivety. The corporate world wasn't a meritocracy where talent naturally rose to the top. It was a battlefield where those willing to claim credit conquered those who quietly excelled. I'd spent years being the brilliant workhorse in the background, trusting that integrity and excellence would be rewarded. The months following my resignation were transformative. I dove into employment law, studied negotiation tactics, researched market rates obsessively. I attended workshops on professional self-advocacy, practiced stating my achievements without apology. The soft-spoken team player who'd let Jenna steal her life's work was gone, replaced by someone who understood that self-worth had to be actively defended. I rebuilt my career methodically, consulting contracts where my name was prominently featured, published papers with sole authorship, a small but growing reputation as someone who delivered results and wouldn't be pushed aside. Each success was a brick in the wall I was building against future exploitation. But the scar Jenna left went deeper than professional pride. She'd stolen more than research. She'd taken my faith in workplace fairness. Every interview since carried the weight of that betrayal. I scrutinized offer letters like legal documents, questioned corporate cultures with the intensity of an investigator, and walked away from opportunities that showed even a hint of the toxic dynamics I'd escaped. That's why Peterson's lowball offer hit differently. It wasn't just about money. It was about recognizing the pattern, the dismissive attitude, the assumption that I'd gratefully accept whatever scraps they offered. The barely concealed amusement at my audacity to know my worth. Iron Vale might have been a different company, but Peterson was cut from the same cloth as Jenna. Someone who saw talent as something to exploit rather than fairly compensate. The anger I'd swallowed in that Chicago auditorium, the indignation I'd converted into polite resignation letters and professional transitions, it all crystallized in that Iron Vale conference room. Peterson's smirk was Jenna's smile. His dismissive chuckle was the echo of her taking credit for my work. The entire scene was a replay of every moment I'd been professionally diminished. Except this time, I had the tools and courage to fight back. Some might call it baggage, carrying that betrayal into new opportunities. I call it wisdom. Jenna Holloway taught me that brilliance without boundaries invites exploitation. That innovation without ownership becomes someone else's success story. That in a world where people like her and Peterson held the keys to advancement, the only way forward was to forge my own locks. So when I walked out of Ironvale that day, I wasn't just rejecting an insulting offer. I was honoring a promise made in a Chicago hotel room 18 months ago. Crying angry tears while watching Jenna's LinkedIn update with her new VP title. Never again would I let someone else define my value. Never again would I sacrifice my worth for the hope of eventual recognition. The recycling industry was about transformation, taking what others discarded and revealing its hidden value. It was time I applied that same principle to my career. And if companies like Ironvale couldn't see the treasure they were throwing away, well, that was their loss. I just didn't know yet how literally true that would become. The Ironvale interview process had started 3 weeks earlier with such promise. Their initial recruiter call painted a picture of innovation, sustainability leadership, and a company culture that valued expertise. I'd prepared meticulously, researching their current recycling yields, identifying inefficiencies in their published processes, and developing a presentation that demonstrated exactly how my methods could boost their recovery rates by 15 to 20%. The technical rounds were exhilarating. I spent 4 hours with their engineering team, whiteboarding complex molecular processes and discussing implementation strategies. Dr. Marcus Webb, their chief technology officer, had literally stood up and applauded when I explained my proprietary method for separating palladium from mixed metal waste streams. "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need," he'd said, pumping my hand enthusiastically. The second round with department heads went even better. I presented my vision for a fully integrated recycling system that could process everything from consumer electronics to industrial catalysts. The head of operations, Sandra Liu, took copious notes and asked the kind of detailed questions that showed she understood the profound implications of my approach. The CFO ran quick calculations on his tablet and actually whistled at the projected cost savings. By the time I reached the final interview, I was confident this was my next home. Ironvale seemed to be everything they advertised, a forward-thinking company ready to invest in cutting-edge talent. The salary range discussed in preliminary calls was appropriate for a senior role, and there had been hints about stock options and performance bonuses. Then Peterson walked in. The energy shift was immediate. Where the technical team had engaged with curiosity and respect, Peterson treated the interview like a formality he needed to endure. He spent more time checking his phone than reviewing my credentials. His questions were generic, pulled from some HR handbook. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? What would you say is your greatest weakness? When he finally slid that offer across the table, the number felt like a slap. $87,000 a year. For context, my last role paid $122,000, and industry standards for someone with my experience ranged from $130,000 to $150,000. Fresh graduates with master's degrees were starting at $75,000. "I think there's been a miscommunication," I said carefully, still hoping this was some administrative error. The range discussed earlier was significantly higher. Peterson's smile was condescending. "Preliminary discussions are just that, preliminary. This is what we're prepared to offer." I pulled out my phone, showing him salary data from 3 different industry surveys. "According to current market analysis, this position should be compensated between—" "Miss Graves," he interrupted, the dismissive use of Miss not lost on me. "We don't base our offers on internet surveys. This is a competitive offer for Ironvale." "It's Dr. Graves," I corrected. "And this offer is 40% below market rate for a senior materials scientist with my qualifications." That's when his associates, 2 younger HR representatives who'd been silent until then, exchanged those looks. The barely suppressed smirks that said they'd seen this dance before. How many qualified candidates had Peterson lowballed? How many had accepted, desperate for the Iron Veil name on their resume? The offer includes excellent benefits, Peterson continued, as if health insurance could compensate for a $40,000 salary gap. And there's potential for growth. Growth from an artificially deflated starting point isn't growth, it's manipulation, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. The laughter started small, one of the associates covering what sounded like a snort. But when Peterson leaned back with that satisfied grin, saying, "Good luck finding something better in this market," they didn't even try to hide their amusement. The conference room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of every professional woman who'd sat in this chair before me, facing the same arithmetic of discrimination. How many had calculated the bills they needed to pay against the insult they were being asked to swallow? How many had smiled and accepted, hoping to prove their worth later? My response came from somewhere deeper than logic or professionalism. It came from that place Jenna Holloway had carved out, the hollow where trust and fair treatment used to live. After I left, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, hands trembling on the steering wheel. The parking garage was dim, fluorescent lights flickering like my confidence. Had I just made the biggest mistake of my career? My savings could last 3 months, maybe 4 if I stretched. The job market was tight, especially for senior positions. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Megan. How did it go? I stared at the screen, unsure how to explain that I'd just walked away from a job at one of the biggest names in recycling, that I'd chosen dignity over security, self-respect over a steady paycheck. Didn't work out. I finally typed. They weren't ready for what I bring to the table. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? Iron Veil, for all its talk of innovation, wasn't ready for someone who knew their worth. Peterson wanted grateful subordinates, not equals who would challenge the status quo. As I drove home through afternoon traffic, I replayed every moment, every word. The doubt was there, sharp and insistent. But underneath it, something else was growing. A quiet certainty that I'd finally done what the woman in Chicago couldn't. I'd stood up, I'd said no, I'd refused to be diminished. Whatever came next, I'd face it knowing I hadn't betrayed myself for a paycheck. In a world full of Petersons and Jennas, that felt like its own kind of victory. Megan showed up at my apartment that evening with Thai takeout and a concerned expression that made me want to lock myself in the bathroom. My cousin had moved to the city 2 years before me, establishing herself as a successful financial analyst. She was the only family I had within 500 miles, and she wore her protective instincts like armor. $35,000 below your last salary? She stabbed her pad thai with unnecessary force. Natalie, that's not just low, it's insulting. Which is why I walked away, I said, pushing rice around my plate. I get that. I do. But... She set down her fork, fixing me with that look that meant a lecture was coming. You've been job hunting for 2 months. Your savings won't last forever. Sometimes we have to swallow our pride and what? Accept being undervalued? The words came out sharper than intended. Take whatever scraps they throw at me because I should be grateful to work for the great Iron Veil Industries? That's not what I'm saying. It's exactly what you're saying. I stood up, needing to move, to pace. You didn't see Peterson's face, Megan. The way he smiled when he lowballed me, like he knew I'd have to take it. Like he'd done this 100 times before. Maybe you could have negotiated. I tried. They laughed at me. Literally laughed. Megan was quiet for a moment, processing this. Bastards, she finally muttered. Yeah. Still, she said carefully. Rent is due in 2 weeks, and your car payment, and I know what my bills are. I collapsed back onto the couch, the weight of financial reality settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I've got 3 months of expenses saved, 4 if I cut back. And then I'll figure it out. I always do. The next 3 days blurred together in a marathon of job applications and networking calls. I refined my resume, Tailored cover letters, reached out to every professional contact who might have a lead. My laptop became my command center, surrounded by coffee cups and color-coded notes about different opportunities. But at night, when the emails were sent and the applications submitted, doubt crept in like fog. I'd lie in bed calculating expenses, wondering if my stand had been principled or just stupid. Pride didn't pay rent. Self-respect didn't fill the gas tank. On the second night, I found myself scrolling through Iron Veil's website, torturing myself with what-ifs. What if I'd just accepted? What if I'd smiled and taken their insulting offer, then worked my way up from inside? Their recycling facility was state-of-the-art, their research budget enormous. I could have done important work there, even if it meant starting from a position of compromise. "Stop it," I said aloud to my empty bedroom. "You're worth more than that." But was I? The job market seemed to disagree. 2 rejections came in that week. Form emails thanking me for my interest but informing me they'd decided to move forward with other candidates. A promising phone screen with a startup ended when they mentioned their budget couldn't accommodate someone of my seniority. I started a spreadsheet, tracking applications and responses. The numbers were depressing. 32 applications sent, 6 responses, 2 phone interviews, 0 offers. On the morning of the 3rd day, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at an email from a recruiting firm. They had a position available, a mid-level role at a small company, paying $25,000 less than my last job. The recruiter had added a note. "I know it's below your range, but given the current market conditions..." My finger hovered over the reply button. This was it, the moment where principles met reality. I could say yes, grateful for any opportunity. I could convince myself it was temporary, just until something better came along. How many compromises started that way? How many careers slowly diminished through 1,000 small surrenders? I closed the email without responding. Instead, I pulled up my research on Iron Veil's recycling processes. If they wouldn't hire me, maybe their competitors would be interested in someone who'd identified inefficiencies in their system. I spent hours preparing a presentation on next-generation recycling methods, focusing on the innovations Peterson had been too arrogant to value. "You're being stubborn," Megan texted that afternoon. "Maybe too stubborn." "Maybe," I replied, "but I'd rather be stubborn than surrender. That doesn't pay bills, Nat." She was right, of course. But as I refined my presentation, detailing processes that could revolutionize rare metal recovery, I felt something I hadn't experienced since walking out of Iron Veil: hope. Not the passive hope of waiting for rescue, but the active hope of someone creating their own opportunities. I sent the presentation to 3 of Iron Veil's competitors that evening. Maybe they'd respond. Maybe they wouldn't. But at least I was fighting for my worth instead of apologizing for it. The night before everything changed, I dreamed about that conference room. But this time, when Peterson laughed, I laughed back. When he said, "Good luck finding something better," I replied, "I don't need to find better. Better will find me." I woke up thinking it was just my subconscious trying to comfort me. I had no idea how prophetic that dream would prove to be. Natalie was reviewing company profiles for her upcoming interviews when her phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed on the screen. She hesitated for a beat before answering. "This is Natalie Graves." "Ms. Graves, this is Gregory Walsh, CEO of Iron Veil Industries." Her heart stopped. She sat up straight, tightening her grip on the phone. She had never spoken to Walsh during the entire hiring process. His name had been a distant presence: boardrooms, quarterly earnings reports, the kind of executive who never concerned himself with candidates like her. "I heard you declined our offer," Walsh said, his tone calm but probing. "That's unusual." Natalie held the silence, waiting for him to continue. "After you left, my engineering leads reviewed your research packet again, specifically your alloy separation protocol. They believe your method could redefine our cost structure for recycled materials." His words landed like a slow, deliberate hammer. "We severely underestimated the impact of your work. The projected margins are far more aggressive than initially assessed." Natalie exhaled quietly and leaned back in her chair. Ms. Graves, are you still there? Yes, she answered, her voice composed. I'm considering what it would take for me to join a company where qualified professionals are ridiculed for knowing their worth. The silence on the line stretched long enough for her to sense the discomfort crackling at the other end. I understand your hesitation, Walsh finally said. So, what would it take? Natalie didn't blink. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind, though never with Ironvale, and certainly not with the CEO himself. I'll need 3 things, she began. First, base compensation at market rate plus 15%, in part to account for the disrespect shown during your offer process. That's fair, Walsh replied, his voice tight. And second, I'll lead the materials development division, full autonomy over research direction and project execution. You'd be reporting directly to me, Walsh said after a moment. Exactly. He cleared his throat. And third, company-wide salary transparency, Natalie said firmly, including published compensation bands, structured to eliminate gender and racial disparities, with a clear roadmap for equity adjustments. That silenced him for real this time. When he spoke again, his voice was slower. The first 2 conditions are doable. The third, it's unconventional for our sector. So was publicly laughing at a specialized candidate during a salary negotiation, Natalie replied, letting her words hang between them. Yet, here we are. She could almost hear him shifting in his seat. You're asking for salary transparency across every department? Yes, she confirmed. And the assurance that historical pay gaps will be addressed, not just acknowledged. Walsh blew out a quiet breath. I'll need to bring this to the board. Can I call you back tomorrow? I'll wait for your call, Natalie said, then ended the conversation without another word. 10 minutes later, her email pinged. It was from Vance Peterson. Ms. I. Graves, I understand you've spoken with Mr. Walsh. Please reconsider our offer. Our engineering schedule has been built around your proposed methodology. We can't meet critical deadlines without your expertise. I apologize if our last meeting left a negative impression. I'd be happy to discuss terms that might make you feel more comfortable joining the team. Natalie stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed her laptop with a small, sharp smile. Later that evening, as she was fixing a cup of tea, her phone rang again. Ms. Graves, Walsh greeted. I spoke with the board this afternoon. And, she asked, voice even, we're prepared to accept your terms, with one modification. We'll implement the transparent salary bands, but it will be phased in over 6 months to ensure proper review of existing contracts. Natalie felt her pulse quicken. She had expected resistance, a drawn-out negotiation, maybe even a flat refusal. Not this. That's acceptable, she said after a brief pause. I want direct involvement in the review process. Of course, Walsh agreed. Our legal team will draft the contract tomorrow. When can you start? Natalie smiled. 2 weeks. Natalie's first day at Ironvale Industries felt less like a triumphant arrival and more like stepping onto a battlefield where no one had told her which side she was supposed to be on. Her office was sleek, glass walls, polished metal fixtures, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. A small adjoining lab had been set aside exclusively for her research team. On paper, it was everything she'd demanded. But the atmosphere inside the division was taut, stretched thin between curiosity, skepticism, and silent hostility. Vance Peterson didn't bother hiding his disdain. On the morning of her first leadership meeting, he entered the conference room, shook her hand with a plastic smile, and sat directly opposite her at the table. Throughout the meeting, he interrupted twice, undermined her project outline once, and smirked when she outlined the phased compensation review. By Friday, Natalie had already compiled preliminary salary data for her division. When she requested full transparency from human resources, they stalled, citing confidentiality protocols. Natalie sent a polite follow-up with a quiet reminder. Per my agreement with Mr. Walsh, I expect this data by noon. At 11:57 m.m., the spreadsheet arrived. It was worse than she expected. Women in comparable roles earned on average 22% less than their male colleagues. Employees with Hispanic or Black surnames were making as much as 18% less than white peers with identical qualifications. Long-serving staff who hadn't aggressively negotiated their salaries were the most underpaid of all. By the end of her first week, Natalie knew two things for certain. She had walked straight into a deeply broken system. She wasn't going to fix it quietly. That Friday afternoon, she called a division-wide meeting. 52 employees crowded into the conference room: engineers, researchers, technicians, and administrative staff. Vance arrived late, his arms folded across his chest, standing in the back with a carefully crafted look of amused detachment. Natalie stood at the front, a simple slide projected behind her. It showed anonymized salary bands, color-coded to highlight disparities. "This is the current state of compensation within our division," she began, letting her words settle in the hushed room. "The data is anonymized, but the patterns are clear and unacceptable." Murmurs rippled across the crowd. People leaned forward, searching the chart for patterns that might affect them. In the next 6 months, Natalie continued, "We'll establish transparent salary bands based on role, experience, and contribution. Adjustments will be made where inequities are identified, regardless of prior negotiations or departmental politics." Her eyes flicked to Vance, who gave a slow, sardonic clap before folding his arms again. "This isn't about causing division," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "It's about correcting it." For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the left side of the room, a quiet voice spoke. About time someone said it out loud. Heads turned. Natalie recognized the speaker, Paloma Ruiz, a junior research analyst with sharp eyes and a reputation for keeping her head down. Paloma flushed, but met Natalie's gaze with a steady nod. Natalie gave a small, approving smile. "Exactly." By Monday morning, whispers had spread through every corridor of Iron Vale. Some employees greeted Natalie with cautious optimism. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few, the ones who likely benefited from the old system, stared with open hostility. At 9:30 a.m., Peterson showed up uninvited at Natalie's office, letting himself in without knocking. He sank into the chair across from her desk, like he owned the place. "You've stirred up quite the mess," he began, his voice low and smooth. "The executive team's concerned." Natalie didn't look up from her project timeline. "I'm sure they are. Compensation data can be misleading. Some employees negotiate better. Others accept lower pay because they value flexibility, benefits, culture. Throwing raw numbers around creates unnecessary tension." Natalie finally met his gaze. "Is that what happened when I negotiated with you?" His smile thinned. "That was different." "No, it wasn't. It's the exact pattern we're fixing, and we're moving forward, whether or not that makes certain people uncomfortable." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Look, Natalie, may I call you Natalie?" "Ms. Graves will be fine." His jaw tightened, but he didn't miss a beat. "Ms. Graves, you're new here. You don't understand the company's culture. Change like this, it doesn't come without resistance. You could seriously damage morale." "Whose morale exactly? The people underpaid for years, or the ones who benefited from that system?" He stood up, smoothing his tie. "The CEO may have signed off on this initiative, but implementation requires buy-in from every department head. My team controls production budgets. Just something for you to consider." Natalie kept her expression neutral. "Thank you for making your position transparent." When Peterson walked out, she opened her laptop and began drafting a detailed report to Gregory Walsh, noting every obstruction, veiled threat, and sudden concern about her compensation review. She hadn't come this far to be intimidated now. The weeks that followed were a careful, deliberate game of chess. One Natalie played with a steady hand and a sharp memory. Peterson and his allies didn't mount an open attack. Instead, they opted for the slow sabotage of bureaucracy. Meeting invites she should have received mysteriously disappeared from her calendar. Budget approvals for lab equipment were delayed without explanation. Project updates she sent to department heads went unanswered, only to resurface in meetings as if they had never been shared. But Natalie wasn't new to this kind of quiet warfare. She documented everything, every delay, every administrative oversight, every conveniently lost email. She kept meticulous records, dates, times, names. When lab equipment requisitions stalled, she found a storage room on the 5th floor that had been unused for years. With the help of her growing circle of allies, they converted it into an auxiliary research space using salvaged equipment and borrowed supplies. One of her first and fiercest allies turned out to be Paloma Ruiz. What started as a hallway conversation quickly turned into late-night brainstorming sessions. Paloma, sharp and resourceful, introduced Natalie to others in the company who'd been passed over, underpaid, or systematically ignored. There was Henry Dalton, a chemical engineer whose innovation in extraction solvents had quietly saved the company hundreds of thousands in production costs, but whose promotion recommendations had been lost in process 3 separate times. And Daisy Kimball, a senior lab technician whose procedural refinements had been rolled out division-wide, without her name ever appearing on a single report. Together, they became Natalie's unofficial task force. They worked long hours refining her extraction method, adapting it to Iron Veil's production models. When requisitions got mysteriously lost, they kept moving, using borrowed supplies and recording every delay with precision. Henry started quietly mirroring their research data to a private, secured cloud server, a safeguard in case the company's IT mysteriously locked them out. By the 6th week, they had produced a fully functional prototype that showed promising results, a 37% increase in rare earth recovery rates, a 44% reduction in chemical waste. It was undeniable, and Natalie wasn't about to let Peterson bury it. She requested a formal presentation slot with the executive team. Peterson tried to block it, citing schedule conflicts and unverified data. Natalie bypassed him and went straight to Walsh's office with a brief, data-backed summary of the prototype's impact on cost reduction. The meeting was set within the hour. Standing before the executive board, Natalie presented her findings with sharp clarity, flanked by Paloma and Henri. The board members leaned in, asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and projected savings. Gregory Walsh himself nodded appreciatively at the ROI charts. Only Peterson sat stone-faced, waiting for his chance to dismantle her work. "These results are preliminary," he finally interjected, voice calm but cutting. "Implementation would require significant retooling of our production line, expenses that haven't been accounted for in our current budgets." Natalie met his gaze coolly. "Actually, they have." She clicked to the next slide, a comprehensive breakdown of costs, retooling, training, contingency funds, all accounted for, with a projected return on investment within 9 months. A quiet murmur of approval circled the table. Peterson's eyes narrowed. "There's still the matter of production disruption. We can't afford downtime on our main line." "Which is why," Natalie replied smoothly, "we've designed a phased implementation using the auxiliary line first. The main line will require only 2 scheduled 48-hour maintenance windows." She clicked to a detailed Gantt chart, highlighting timelines and key milestones. By the time the meeting ended, the board had unanimously approved expedited funding for full implementation. Walsh approached her as the others filtered out. "Outstanding work, Ms. Graves. This is exactly why I brought you in." "Thank you, Mr. Walsh," Natalie replied, "though I've encountered a few administrative challenges along the way." Walsh arched a brow. "We'll need to discuss that." Across the room, Peterson watched them, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. The following morning, Natalie arrived to find her keycard access to the main lab revoked. Security had no explanation. She texted Paloma, who let her in through a side entrance. "It's getting worse," Paloma whispered as they slipped inside. "Last night, the research server was locked for maintenance. We lost access to our entire simulation archive." Natalie's lips curled into a thin smile. "Do we have backups?" Henry appeared from behind a row of equipment, nodding. "Since week 2, They don't know we've been mirroring everything. Good, Natalie said quietly. Then let's play along. Act like we've been set back. I want to see how far they'll go. Because Peterson had just escalated the game, and Natalie was ready for checkmate. It didn't take long for Peterson to make his boldest move yet. 3 days after the board approved Natalie's project, he called an unscheduled department meeting while she was on a critical supplier call, a call she had coordinated for weeks. By the time she arrived, Peterson was wrapping up his presentation to the entire operations team. Which is why we're placing Dr. Graves's project on a temporary hold while we reassess resource allocation. Peterson was saying, his tone casual, confident. Preliminary data, while promising, still requires further verification before we proceed with full-scale implementation. Natalie stepped into the doorway, her voice sharp. That's interesting, especially considering the board approved expedited funding 2 days ago. The room fell silent. Peterson's thin smile never wavered. Ms. Graves, glad you could join us. Yes, there was initial approval, but upon reviewing departmental resources, I've determined we need to postpone the implementation until next quarter. Natalie's eyes narrowed. And does Mr. Walsh know you're overriding a board-approved initiative? A flicker of something, uncertainty, crossed Peterson's face before he regained his composure. Mr. Walsh understands the complexities of production management. This is a delay, not a cancellation. Natalie stepped forward, her voice calm and cutting. That's surprising, because the reason I was late is that I was finalizing the contract with Adaptive Systems, the supplier for our new equipment, a contract signed by Mr. Walsh himself this morning. She raised her tablet, displaying the signed agreement. Delivery begins Monday. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Peterson's face paled. Now, Natalie continued, scanning the team. Let's review the actual implementation timeline. I'll be assigning roles and setting expectations for the next phase. For the next 30 minutes, she took charge, outlining responsibilities with precision. Peterson sat rigid, lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. When the meeting adjourned, he brushed past her near the door. You've made a serious mistake, he hissed under his breath. No one is irreplaceable. Natalie met his glare with a cold smile. That's where you're wrong. Some people are. The real mistake is not knowing who they are. The next few weeks moved like a storm. The new equipment arrived on schedule. Natalie's team, Paloma, Henri, Daisy, and a dozen more, worked tirelessly through long shifts and weekends. When sabotage attempts followed, mislabeled supplies, calibration errors, sudden scheduling conflicts, they anticipated and countered every move. They documented every incident, every delay, every whispered instruction Peterson gave to undermine them. And through it all, the compensation equity review pressed forward. Working with HR and finance, Natalie identified 87 employees underpaid by industry and internal standards. The adjustments would cost Iron Veil roughly $3 million annually, a hefty figure, but insignificant compared to the savings her extraction process promised. 3 months after her arrival, the new system launched on the auxiliary production line. The results shattered even their most optimistic projections. A 41% increase in rare earth yield, a 46% reduction in chemical waste, an annual savings forecast in the double-digit millions. The board erupted with praise. Walsh brought clients and investors on special tours. Peterson, once a looming presence in every meeting, now found himself isolated, bypassed, and carefully watched. And then came the company's quarterly town hall, the perfect stage. Traditionally, each department head presented their achievements. Peterson spoke just before Natalie. He stood before the entire company, weaving a careful narrative that credited his team with operational efficiencies, many of which, Natalie knew, her team had pioneered. She sat in the front row, silent, watching. When it was her turn, Natalie walked to the podium, cool and composed. Before I share the materials division's results, she began, I want to clarify a few points from the previous presentation. On the screen behind her, she displayed side-by-side images of the production line improvements Peterson had claimed. These adjustments were actually designed by Henry Dalton, she said, nodding to him in the crowd. His analysis of the separation phase removed a key bottleneck in our process. His contribution deserves recognition. The room buzzed. Peterson shifted in his chair, jaw tight. Natalie continued, methodically crediting every overlooked team member for innovations Peterson had tried to claim. And when she revealed the finalized salary adjustment data, the auditorium erupted into applause. As the thunderous clapping echoed, Peterson slipped out a side door, unnoticed by most, but not by Natalie. The next morning, Walsh called her into his office. Peterson sat stiffly beside the HR director. Natalie, Walsh began, Peterson's raised some concerns about your management style. Peterson spoke up, arms crossed. She's creating division, undermining authority, building a parallel power structure. Natalie remained composed. Before we continue, she said, pulling out her tablet, I'd like to share some documentation. She projected a meticulous log of every obstruction, delay, sabotage attempt, and credit misappropriation, emails, server logs, eyewitness accounts. Peterson paled as Walsh's expression darkened with every slide. Is this accurate? Walsh asked quietly. Peterson stammered. It's out of context. Walsh cut him off. This is unacceptable. By afternoon, a company-wide memo announced Peterson's reassignment to an external advisory role, effective immediately. That evening, Walsh called Natalie back in. I want you to take over operations, he said simply. Effective now. Natalie studied him. The compensation initiative continues. Walsh nodded. I want it expanded. You've set a new standard here, Natalie. And it's exactly what this company needs. Natalie shook his hand. 6 months after walking out of a humiliating interview, she sat at the head of Ironvale's strategy table, not as an outsider begging for a fair offer, but as a leader who had redefined the company's future. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this and share your thoughts with us.